The silence in the boardroom was deafening. 24 hours ago, Alexander Morrison had been worth $3.2 billion. Now, as he stared at the withdrawal notice on his mahogany desk, he watched his empire crumble with a single signature. The document bore the letterhead of Pemberton Capital Management, his largest investor, representing nearly 40% of his company's funding. At the bottom, in elegant script, was a name that made his blood run cold: Eleanor Pemberton. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But this story doesn't begin in that boardroom. It begins 3 weeks earlier, on a rainy Tuesday morning in downtown Seattle, when Alexander Morrison made the biggest mistake of his life. A mistake that involved a 73-year-old woman, a grocery store, and an act of cruelty that would ultimately cost him everything he had built. Alexander Morrison wasn't born into wealth. He had clawed his way to the top through sheer determination and ruthless ambition. At 38, he was the founder and CEO of Morrison Industries, a tech conglomerate that had revolutionized everything from artificial intelligence to renewable energy storage. His company's headquarters, a gleaming 40-story tower in Seattle's South Lake Union district, stood as a monument to his success. Morrison Industries employed over 15,000 people across 12 countries. Alexander's personal net worth had crossed the billion-dollar mark 3 years earlier, making him one of the youngest billionaires in America. Forbes had featured him on their cover twice. Time magazine had named him one of the world's most influential people. He owned penthouses in New York and Los Angeles, a yacht moored in Monaco, and a private jet that he used like most people used taxis. But success had changed Alexander in ways he didn't recognize. The young entrepreneur who had once worked 18-hour days in a cramped garage had evolved into someone who viewed the world through the lens of net worth and market capitalization. People weren't individuals to him anymore. They were assets, liabilities, or irrelevant obstacles to be navigated around. Alexander's typical Tuesday began at 5:30 a.m. with a workout in his private gym on the 39th floor of Morrison Tower. His personal trainer, Marcus, had been with him for 3 years and knew better than to attempt small talk during their sessions. Alexander's mind was always elsewhere, calculating quarterly projections, planning acquisitions, or strategizing how to crush competitors who dared to challenge his market dominance. After his workout and a precisely timed 15-minute shower, Alexander would review overnight reports from his international offices while his personal chef, Catherine, prepared his breakfast: steel-cut oats with organic blueberries, black coffee, and a vitamin regimen worth more than most people's monthly grocery bills. Every detail of his morning routine was optimized for maximum efficiency. By 7 a.m., he was in his private elevator descending to the parking garage where his driver Thomas waited with the midnight blue Bentley Mulsanne. The drive to his first meeting would typically involve a conference call with his executive team, reviewing market fluctuations that had occurred while Seattle slept. What most people didn't know about Alexander's meteoric rise was how heavily it depended on a single massive investment that had arrived at a crucial moment 5 years earlier. Morrison Industries had been on the verge of bankruptcy, a promising startup burning through capital faster than it could generate revenue. Alexander had been 3 weeks away from losing everything, when a representative from Pemberton Capital Management had appeared with an offer that seemed too good to be true. Pemberton Capital wasn't just any investment firm. Founded in 1987 by the legendary financier William Pemberton, the company managed assets worth over $50 billion. They were known for making bold, early investments in companies that others considered too risky. Amazon, Tesla, Netflix. Pemberton had been there first, turning modest investments into astronomical returns. When Pemberton offered to invest $200 million in Morrison Industries, Alexander didn't ask too many questions. The terms were surprisingly favorable. Pemberton would take a 35% stake in the company, but would remain a silent partner, allowing Alexander to maintain operational control. There were only 2 conditions. Pemberton would have the right to withdraw their investment with 90 days' notice, and all major strategic decisions would require approval from the Pemberton board. The injection of capital had transformed Morrison Industries overnight. Alexander had been able to expand internationally, acquire smaller competitors, and invest in the research and development that had made his company the tech giant it was today. More importantly, Pemberton's reputation had opened doors to other investors, creating a snowball effect that had multiplied his company's value by nearly 1,500%. Over the years, Alexander had maintained a professional but distant relationship with his primary benefactors. Quarterly reports were submitted on time. Board approvals were requested when necessary. But he had never met William Pemberton in person, and their communication had always been handled through intermediaries and lawyers. This arrangement suited Alexander perfectly. He preferred to view Pemberton Capital as a source of funding rather than as partners with whom he needed to maintain personal relationships. In his mind, business was business, a series of transactions based on mutual benefit rather than personal connections. By 2024, Alexander had cultivated an image that was equal parts admiration and intimidation. He was known for his perfectly tailored Armani suits, his collection of rare watches worth more than most people's homes, and his ability to remember financial data with photographic precision. Business magazines loved to profile him as the epitome of the self-made American success story. But beneath the polished exterior was a man who had gradually lost touch with the fundamental human connections that had once motivated his drive to succeed. Alexander's relationships had become transactional. His romantic partnerships typically lasted only a few months before the women realized that they were competing with quarterly earnings reports for his attention. He had distanced himself from his middle-class family in Ohio, viewing their concerns about his work-life balance as evidence that they couldn't understand the pressures of operating at his level. Even his friendships were strategic alliances with other wealthy entrepreneurs and powerful politicians. Alexander attended charity galas not out of genuine compassion, but because they provided networking opportunities. He donated to causes that enhanced his public image rather than addressing issues he cared about personally. His executive team had learned to present information in ways that reinforced his existing beliefs rather than challenging his assumptions. Alexander surrounded himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear, creating an echo chamber that amplified his confidence while eliminating dissenting voices that might have provided valuable perspective. The irony was that Alexander's isolation from ordinary human experiences had made him brilliant at reading market trends and business opportunities, while making him completely blind to the personal dynamics that would ultimately determine his fate. He could predict how consumers would respond to new technologies, but he couldn't recognize when his own behavior was creating enemies who had the power to destroy everything he had built. This was the man who walked out of Morrison Tower on that rainy Tuesday morning 3 weeks before his world collapsed, confident, powerful, and completely unaware that he was about to encounter someone who would expose the fundamental weakness in his carefully constructed empire. Someone who would force him to confront the reality that in a world built on relationships, his contempt for anyone he considered beneath his status would prove to be his greatest vulnerability. As Thomas pulled the Bentley into downtown traffic, Alexander was reviewing acquisition targets on his tablet, planning his next move in the endless chess game of corporate expansion. He had no way of knowing that in less than an hour, a 73-year-old woman named Eleanor would provide him with a lesson in humility that would cost him everything he had spent his life building. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. While Alexander Morrison was building his tech empire in Seattle, 3,000 miles away in Boston, Eleanor Pemberton was living a life that few would associate with one of America's most powerful investment dynasties. At 73, she had deliberately chosen simplicity over the lavish lifestyle her family's wealth could easily afford. Eleanor's morning routine began at 6 a.m. in her modest two-bedroom apartment in Cambridge, just a few blocks from Harvard University. The apartment, filled with well-worn books, handmade quilts, and photographs spanning 7 decades, reflected a woman who valued memories over material possessions. Her kitchen table, scarred from years of use, had been her late husband's workbench before she converted it. A reminder of the man who had taught her that true wealth came from relationships, not bank accounts. Eleanor's story began in 1951, when she was born into a family that was already synonymous with financial power. Her father, William Pemberton Sr., had built the foundation of what would become Pemberton Capital Management by making shrewd investments during the post-war economic boom. But unlike many wealthy families who focus primarily on preserving their status, the Pembertons had always believed that true success meant using their resources to create opportunities for others. Eleanor had grown up attending board meetings as a child, not as preparation for taking over the family business, but as education in the responsibility that came with wealth. Her father would often say, "Money is like water. It's only valuable when it flows to where it's needed most." This philosophy shaped Eleanor's worldview from an early age. After graduating from Radcliffe College with a degree in social work, Eleanor had surprised her family by rejecting their expectations that she would join the investment firm. Instead, she spent her 20s working in community centers in Boston's most challenging neighborhoods, helping families navigate the bureaucratic systems that often kept them trapped in poverty. It was during this period that she met Dr. James Mitchell, a pediatrician who ran a free clinic in Roxbury. James shared Eleanor's belief that privilege came with obligation, and their partnership, both personal and professional, had defined the next 40 years of her life. They married in 1978 and spent their honeymoon not in Europe or the Caribbean, but building a school in rural Guatemala. When Eleanor's father passed away in 1987, she inherited not just a massive fortune, but the responsibility of guiding Pemberton Capital Management's investment philosophy. However, rather than taking an active role in day-to-day operations, Eleanor had chosen to work behind the scenes, using her influence to ensure that the firm's investments aligned with her values. Her approach was unprecedented in the world of high finance. While other investment firms focused solely on maximizing returns, Eleanor insisted that Pemberton Capital consider the broader impact of their investments on communities and workers. Companies that mistreated employees, polluted the environment, or engaged in unethical business practices found themselves excluded from Pemberton's portfolio, regardless of their profit potential. This philosophy had initially frustrated some of Pemberton's junior partners, who argued that Eleanor's ethical constraints were limiting their earning potential. But over the decades, her approach had proven remarkably prescient. Companies that prioritized long-term sustainability and employee welfare consistently outperformed those focused solely on short-term profits. Eleanor's greatest talent lay in identifying entrepreneurs who shared her values, individuals who were building companies not just to accumulate wealth, but to solve real problems and create positive change. She had an uncanny ability to spot authentic visionaries among the countless pitch presentations that crossed her desk. 5 years earlier, when Morrison Industries had been struggling to survive, Eleanor had personally reviewed Alexander's business plan and financial projections. On paper, the investment looked risky, a young company burning through capital with ambitious but unproven technologies. Most investment committees would have passed without a second thought. But Eleanor had been intrigued by something beyond the numbers. Alexander's early interviews and presentations had spoken passionately about using technology to democratize access to renewable energy and artificial intelligence. His vision wasn't just about building a profitable company, it was about creating tools that could help solve climate change and bridge the digital divide. More importantly, Eleanor had been impressed by Alexander's background. Unlike many tech entrepreneurs who came from privileged families with extensive connections, Alexander had grown up in a working-class household in Ohio. His father had been a factory worker, his mother a nurse. He had worked multiple jobs to pay for college, and had started his company in a garage with just $3,000 in savings. Eleanor saw in Alexander's story an opportunity to support someone who understood struggle and might use success to lift others up. The $200 million investment had been her personal decision, overruling the concerns of several Pemberton board members who considered the risk too great. The terms of the investment had been deliberately structured to give Alexander maximum freedom to pursue his vision. Eleanor believed that micromanaging entrepreneurs stifled innovation, so she had insisted on a hands-off approach that would allow Morrison Industries to grow organically. Over the 5 years since the initial investment, Eleanor had watched Alexander's transformation with growing concern. The quarterly reports showed spectacular financial growth, but they also revealed troubling changes in the company's culture and values. Morrison Industries had begun acquiring smaller competitors and shutting down their research divisions, eliminating hundreds of jobs in the process. The company's environmental initiatives, once a central part of Alexander's pitch, had been quietly scaled back in favor of more profitable ventures. Most disturbing to Eleanor, reports from industry contacts suggested that Morrison Industries had developed a reputation for aggressive business practices that prioritized profit over partnerships. Eleanor's attempts to address these concerns through formal channels had been politely deflected. Alexander's responses to her inquiries were professionally crafted, but essentially meaningless. Corporate speak that acknowledged her questions without actually answering them. It was clear that he viewed her as a source of funding, rather than a partner whose input might be valuable. The breaking point had come 6 months earlier when Eleanor learned that Morrison Industries was planning to acquire a small renewable energy startup called Green Tech Solutions. On the surface, the acquisition made perfect business sense. Green Tech had developed innovative battery technology that could significantly improve Morrison's energy storage products. But Eleanor knew the fuller story. Green Tech's founder, Maria Santos, was a brilliant engineer who had been developing affordable solar solutions specifically for low-income communities. Maria had repeatedly refused acquisition offers from larger companies because she wanted to maintain her focus on accessibility rather than maximizing profits. According to Eleanor's sources, Alexander had used Morrison Industries' superior resources to poach Green Tech's key employees and steal their research, leaving Maria's company unable to compete. When Green Tech inevitably collapsed, Morrison Industries had acquired their patents for a fraction of their true value, effectively stealing 5 years of innovation from a woman whose only crime was prioritizing purpose over profit. For Eleanor, the Green Tech situation represented everything wrong with the modern business world. Powerful companies using their resources to crush smaller competitors, rather than finding ways to collaborate and innovate together. It was the opposite of everything she had tried to promote through Pemberton Capital's investment strategy. More personally, it forced Eleanor to confront an uncomfortable truth about her own role in Alexander's transformation. By providing him with virtually unlimited resources and minimal oversight, had she enabled the very behavior she despised? Had her belief in giving entrepreneurs freedom created a monster who was now using her money to destroy the exact type of purpose-driven company she wanted to support? Eleanor's husband James had passed away 2 years earlier after a long battle with cancer, leaving her to grapple with these questions alone. In his final months, James had encouraged her to take a more active role in ensuring that their investments reflected their values. "Money without moral guidance is just fuel for destruction," he had told her during one of their last conversations. Now, as Eleanor reviewed the latest reports about Morrison Industries' business practices, she realized that James had been right. Alexander Morrison had become exactly the type of ruthless corporate leader that she had spent her life trying to counteract. The question was what, if anything, she could do about it. The answer would come sooner than she expected, in the form of a chance encounter that would give her unprecedented insight into the man she had helped create, and the opportunity to hold him accountable for what he had become. 6 months after Eleanor Pemberton's withdrawal had dismantled his empire, Alexander Morrison sat in a coffee shop he never would have entered during his billionaire days. The cramped space in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood buzzed with students, freelancers, and artists, people he had once dismissed as irrelevant to his world of high-stakes business deals. The transformation in Alexander's appearance was startling. Gone were the custom-tailored suits and luxury watches. Instead, he wore simple jeans and a plain sweater, his once perfectly groomed hair now longer and more natural. The sharp angles of stress that had defined his face during his corporate years had softened, replaced by an expression of genuine curiosity about the conversations happening around him. The immediate aftermath of Eleanor's withdrawal had been devastating in ways that went far beyond financial loss. Within 48 hours of Pemberton Capital's announcement, Morrison Industries' stock price had plummeted by 70%. Other investors, spooked by the sudden exit of the company's largest backer, had triggered a cascade of withdrawal requests that left Alexander scrambling to maintain basic operations. But the financial collapse was only the beginning. As news of the withdrawal spread through Seattle's tight-knit tech community, Alexander found himself facing a reckoning with former colleagues, employees, and business partners who had witnessed his transformation over the years, but had been too intimidated or financially dependent to speak up. Maria Santos, the founder of Green Tech Solutions, whose company Alexander had destroyed, published an open letter detailing how Morrison Industries had systematically stolen her innovations and driven her team into bankruptcy. Her account, which went viral on social media, prompted dozens of other entrepreneurs to share similar stories of Alexander's predatory business practices. The picture that emerged was of a man who had gradually lost sight of the values that had initially driven his success. Employee testimonials revealed a workplace culture where dissent was punished, where innovation was stifled by Alexander's need to control every decision, and where the company's stated mission of improving the world had been abandoned in favor of maximizing quarterly returns. 3 weeks after the collapse, as Alexander sat in his empty penthouse surrounded by legal documents and liquidation notices, he received an unexpected visitor. Eleanor Pemberton had flown to Seattle, not to gloat over his downfall, but to offer something he had never expected: guidance. "I didn't come here to lecture you," Eleanor said, settling into the chair across from Alexander's kitchen table, the only furniture he hadn't yet sold to pay creditors. "I came because I believe people can change, and because I feel partially responsible for what you became." The conversation that followed lasted nearly 6 hours and fundamentally altered Alexander's understanding of success, responsibility, and his own role in his downfall. Eleanor didn't simply criticize his business practices. She helped him understand how his isolation from ordinary human experiences had created blind spots that made him vulnerable to his own worst impulses. "Power without perspective is just potential for destruction," Eleanor explained. "You became so focused on competing with other billionaires that you forgot why you started the company in the first place. You surrounded yourself with people who told you what you wanted to hear instead of what you needed to know." More importantly, Eleanor shared her own story of learning to use privilege responsibly. She spoke about the mistakes she had made in her early years, the relationships she had damaged through assumptions and arrogance, and the long process of learning to see beyond her own perspective. Eleanor's visit planted the seeds for what would become Alexander's most important project, rebuilding not just his career, but his character. The process began with a series of uncomfortable conversations with people he had wronged over the years. Alexander's first stop was GreenTech Solutions' former headquarters, where he found Maria Santos working as a consultant for other renewable energy startups. The meeting was tense and emotionally charged, but Alexander came prepared not with excuses or justifications, but with a detailed plan for making amends. Using the proceeds from selling his personal assets, Alexander established a fund specifically designed to compensate GreenTech's former employees and support Maria's new ventures. More importantly, he publicly acknowledged his role in destroying her company and used his remaining industry connections to help her secure new funding and partnerships. Similar conversations followed with dozens of other entrepreneurs, employees, and business partners who had suffered from Alexander's ruthless business practices. Each meeting was humbling and often painful, but they gradually helped Alexander understand the human cost of his pursuit of success. As Alexander worked through the process of making amends, he began developing a fundamentally different approach to business and success. Instead of viewing competitors as enemies to be destroyed, he started seeing them as potential collaborators who might help solve larger problems. The coffee shop where Alexander now spent his mornings became a symbol of this transformation. Rather than networking events in exclusive clubs, he found himself having meaningful conversations with baristas, students, and small business owners who offered perspectives he had never considered during his corporate years. These conversations led to Alexander's next venture, a consulting firm focused on helping small businesses and social entrepreneurs navigate the challenges of scaling their operations without compromising their values. The firm, called Second Chance Solutions, operated on a radically different model from his previous company. Instead of seeking to maximize profits, Second Chance Solutions measured success by the positive impact its clients had on their communities. Alexander worked with a diverse team of consultants who came from various backgrounds: former nonprofit leaders, community organizers, and entrepreneurs who had built successful businesses while maintaining their ethical commitments. 6 months after their first meeting, Alexander proposed a partnership that surprised even Eleanor, using her expertise and his hard-won understanding of business failures to create a foundation focused on preventing other entrepreneurs from making the same mistakes he had made. The Eleanor Foundation, launched with funding from both Pemberton Capital and Alexander's remaining assets, became a unique resource for early-stage companies. Rather than simply providing capital, the foundation offered comprehensive support that included mentorship, ethical guidance, and connections to communities that could benefit from the entrepreneur's innovations. Alexander's role in the foundation was deliberately humble. He served as a cautionary example and advisor rather than a leader. His presentations to young entrepreneurs focused not on his former success, but on the mistakes that had led to his downfall, and the lessons he had learned from rebuilding his life and career. 2 years after his empire's collapse, Alexander found himself in a grocery store in Cambridge, Massachusetts, shopping for ingredients for a dinner he was preparing for Eleanor and several foundation partners. As he waited in line, he noticed an elderly man struggling to count change for his groceries, clearly embarrassed by the delay he was causing. Without hesitation, Alexander stepped forward and quietly offered to cover the difference. But instead of the grand gesture he might have made during his billionaire days, this was a simple act of human kindness, offering help in a way that preserved the man's dignity while solving an immediate problem. The elderly man thanked him with a warmth that reminded Alexander of the grocery store encounter that had changed his life. But this time, Alexander was on the other side of the interaction, offering assistance rather than humiliation. As Alexander reflected on his journey from billionaire to bankruptcy to rebuilding, he realized that the measure of success he had spent his life pursuing, wealth, power, and recognition, had been fundamentally flawed. True success, he had learned, came from the positive impact one had on other people's lives and the relationships built through mutual respect and shared purpose. The Alexander Morrison who emerged from his humbling was not trying to reclaim his former status or rebuild his empire. Instead, he was focused on using his experience, both positive and negative, to help others avoid the traps that had ultimately destroyed everything he thought he valued. Eleanor Pemberton had given him something more valuable than the original $200 million investment. She had given him the opportunity to discover who he could become when success was measured not by what he accumulated, but by what he contributed. The billionaire who had humiliated an old woman in a grocery store had learned the hardest lesson of all, that true power comes not from what you can take from others, but from what you choose to give back. And in that transformation, both Alexander and Eleanor had found something worth far more than money: the satisfaction of using their resources and experience to create a better world for the next generation of dreamers and builders. The story of Alexander Morrison's rise, fall, and redemption became a case study in business schools across the country, not as an example of entrepreneurial success, but as a demonstration of how character and values ultimately determine whether achievements create lasting positive change or merely temporary accumulation of wealth. For Alexander, the true victory was not in rebuilding his fortune, but in becoming the kind of person he wished he had been during his first climb to success. The humiliation he had experienced in that grocery store had become the foundation for a life of purpose, humility, and genuine human connection. And Eleanor Pemberton, the woman who had seen potential in a young entrepreneur and had the courage to hold him accountable when he lost his way, continued her quiet work of using wealth as a tool for creating opportunities rather than accumulating power. Together, they had proven that it's never too late to change course, and that the most meaningful transformations often begin with the most painful moments of recognition. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.